We talked about ERGs, and I suppose this conversation made it really so much easier for all of us to understand that it's about building community, it's about building even the lobbying power, alliances, friendships, making your work experience much deeper if you're skillful really in doing it and creating an authentic ERG network. Now we want to get a little deeper into processes themselves. Here to talk to us, Magdalena Bukała, Akamai Inclusion, Diversity and Engagement Manager. Magdalena, it's great to see you and have you joined the conference. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So not my first time, but I don't think that I had the opportunity to meet Sandra. So hi, Sandra. Lovely to see you and thank you for having me
Hello,
again.
nice to meet you too. Great to have you here.
Yeah, I remember it's not your first time. You were not there last year, but I think it was 2 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You're exactly right.
And it was a great conversation, Magdalena. So our expectations are just higher today. No pressure.
And there are
hope I
two
will be
people
able
with the
to
expectations.
Two
satisfy
people
you.
with expectations, but you've already been granted a gracious compliment, so expectations going a little bit down. How to optimize the IDE processes. First of all, why IDE, Magdalena? Because it's not the first time that I hear there's more stress on inclusion in the acronym itself, or it's not just that you want to stand out with the acronym.
So I would love to talk about the optimization in general in the IDE world, but also in terms of the ERGs. Because I know it might not be the sexiest topic that you can talk about.
It can,
doesn't
as we
seem
have
to
just
be.
proved.
Yeah, to me at least, this is something that is interesting, and I've been focused on process optimization throughout my whole career. So I started in the BPO business where the processes were, as we all know, well measured because we're working with customers directly. So we had strict procedures. Everything was well balanced. We had process maps. So that was an interesting part of my career, just those couple of years. And when I moved into the IDE environment, I just noticed so many differences, but at the same time, I had this huge need to start optimizing the processes just to help build the structure around the ERGs and in general in the IDE world. And that's how a number of projects that I led came about as well.
What does optimization for IDE really mean? Can we start here?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that it means building the structure that can support the growth and also the well-being in general of the ERGs that can support the IDE in terms of the inclusion, diversity that we want to lead in the organizations. So it is building the working structure that is making it easier for all the stakeholders that are engaged just to make a change, to make a lasting change. And I also just on top of that, I really enjoyed what Tatiana said because congratulations to Cisco on having the 10-year anniversary. And I just took a note of why the Women Network in Cisco was so successful. And I remember Tatiana mentioning that it was around culture, support of the ERG leads, so the executive sponsorship. And the third thing is something that I really like the most, which is the network and the exchange of ideas, because actually it's through dialogue and through establishing trust and great working relationship with our partners and stakeholders that we can really build the optimized way of doing things in the IDE world. So I was definitely happy to hear that networking and dialogue and exchange of ideas was also important for Cisco. So it's exactly the same for Akamai.
You mentioned setting up the right structure, hopefully a mature structure in the process. So what would be the actual steps you're taking to optimizing the process? Is there a sequence, a particular order in which those steps should be taken?
That's a great question. So when I came to Akamai, the IDE world and the ERGs world especially were totally new to me. So first I just started to ask the questions like, why are we doing that? Just some basic questions to establish what is the value of having the ERGs and having the spread IDE into the culture. When I started asking these questions, I realized that it is somewhat similar to the BPO business before, because I also just needed a clear map of the stakeholders, of people who are engaged in that, although it wasn't as easy to get it in the IDE world. Akamai has over 10,000 employees globally. So I started from mapping out the the people, the IDE enthusiasts around the globe, just to make sure that I'm talking to the right people. And I just use the IDE enthusiasts deliberately because, as we mentioned, and you highlighted that in a number of occasions during the panel that we had today, that we are talking about people who are voluntarily doing this work. So for it was tough in the beginning. I ended up doing over 80 interviews with different people globally who are those IDE enthusiasts and are really keen on making their particular centers great and of embedding the Akamai culture in the organization. So I did the interviews. My role was to listen and learn, and later on to combine the results and just derive some best practices and recommendations for the business. It was a lot of talking. It took me about 4 or even 5 months to do all those interviews and just gather the notes and feedback. But it was great because I was able to establish the network that Tatiana talked about, and just make sure that we, as a global IDE office with a couple of employees, we will be able to really give a decent response to the problems that people are facing, the Akamai employees are facing in those smaller Akamai locations, because it shouldn't be central. To me, the ERGs and the IDE world should be also respectable of the global versus the local. So it's always this balance that is the key.
Hard to disagree. It's really admirable that you're putting so much maturity into the process itself, setting up this structure and making sure that you talk to enough people and make the effort before you do anything that looks like imposition, trying to execute a top-down order, so to say. So first listening to the organization bottom up, and then only try to communicate something.
Listen to understand, because often we go and listen, not necessarily to understand, but just as a technique of gaining some buy-in and then going against that. So I think what I've heard here in particular is this focus on understanding and empathizing with others before deciding on specific actions.
Magda, let me ask you, a bit on a personal note, perhaps. You've talked to hundreds of people, as you've said, so many interviews, so much direct communication. What's your why for this particular area? Why do you do it? How do you really build that much enthusiasm with a certain goal in mind?
For me, it is, first to comment on what you mentioned before, it is much more around listening than talking, that's for sure, and listening to understand and learning to understand first before we recommend. And for the goals, I think the ERGs to me have 3 basic functions. The first one is building the community. So it is about the togetherness, it is about the engagement, so that's a given. The second one is definitely developing its members. So we should remember that when we're talking about the ERG employees or ERG members and the Akamai employees in general, we are talking about those enthusiasts who are not being paid for doing the job, right? They are just really passionate about the discipline. So for the ERGs to function well, it is critically important to give the development opportunities to their members, to their leaders, to have specific programs. We talked about remuneration, so Akamai doesn't yet remunerate the ERG leaders in the strict sense of this word, but we give a lot of development opportunities to them. We have specified training courses for the leaders so that they are engaged and they know that there is certain investment being made. And the third one is solving business problems. So I think that's exactly where optimization comes into play very nicely, because there has to be a value proposition to be able to build a case for the business, for the ERGs to grow, to get the money from the executive sponsors. You have to be able to say, what is the value add of having
Magdalena,
an ERG in the business?
Tell me, please, there are 4 words that stand out in the way you think about it, and that would be transparency, accountability, community, and last but not least, simplicity. But as you address those 4 semantic pillars, if you like, you attach a lot of importance of networking and trust to optimizing IDE processes. What would you say about that?
So the trust is, for me, the underlying factor to build those relationships when we're talking about the structures that are well embedded, but also spread. They're quite loose still. So we have people who are meeting, let's say, monthly on different events. We want to keep them engaged. And I think that's somewhat the easier part. To me, the most difficult piece is to make sure that there is transparency in the processes and how they operate, so that if I'm a new joiner, if I'm a new member of an ERG, I have a welcome pack, and it's not only gadgets, I have the procedures, I know how to change my pronouns, for example, in the system. I have everything highlighted. So the work of the IDE and E office should be very much hands-on. In my opinion, we shouldn't be hiding in the corners, just from time to time providing some guidance. I think we have to really help the organization to build this strict procedures, maybe not strict, to build strong structures and procedures, to have them in place so that it is clear and understandable for all the new members, or all the members of the ERGs in general. Accountability, so that is actually quite nicely linked with what I just mentioned, because it's the intent and it's the impact that the office is having on the partners, or the parties that we are working with. Transparency is something that I am also very much passionate about. I took a lot of time, the project that I just called out, and so the interviews that I also did, those 80 interviews, I started from there, and then we built something that we call the inventory. The inventory right now has over 600 records of different programs around the inclusion, diversity, engagement that are done in different sites. So it's a huge inventory of processes, of names of people, of contacts that we have, that is open to the organization. So whenever there's, let's say, a branding event and someone is looking for great contact internally, because there is a post going to be done around women empowerment, then the inventory is also serving the branding team, as they can go in and just check out, okay, this is the program that we did around women empowerment. These are my contact people. It also helps us a lot to get a lot of insight into what the organization is doing right now, so that we can advise the business better. So also, if you imagine that you would want to make a new podcast around diversity, or you would want to hire in a more diverse way, we can go into the inventory, and based on the interviews and later on further conversations with the business, I can advise you to reach out to certain people and just tell you, okay, these are the reports that we did around it. The project was, done, let's say, in Singapore. So it's just much easier to get the data when it's really there at the hand. So that's what I mean with transparency, just clear-cut systems in place.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. So thank you for joining us at this conference, and all the best.
Thank you, Magda.
Thank you so much.